Dad gave the business to my brother-in-law instead of me at his retirement party. The retirement party was supposed to be a celebration. For 30 years, my dad had run a successful family business, one that I'd grown up in, one that I had spent my entire adult life helping to build. I had put in the hours, worked weekends, missed holidays, and poured my heart into the company, just like my father had. Everyone in the family knew that I was the natural heir to the business. I had been preparing for this moment for as long as I could remember. So when Dad announced he was retiring, I figured it was just a formality that he'd pass the torch to me. The whole family was gathered at a fancy hotel downtown, a beautiful venue, with chandeliers glittering like stars above us. It was the kind of event my father loved, elegant, grand, and full of people congratulating him. I stood beside him, grinning as guests came up to offer their well wishes. Then, the time came for Dad to make his big announcement. He tapped his glass with a spoon, and the crowd quieted down, all eyes on him. He spoke about his journey, how he'd started the business from scratch, how much it meant to him, and how grateful he was for the support of his family. I watched him, feeling a mix of pride and anticipation. This was it. Any second now he would call my name, and I would step up, ready to take over the business that had been my entire life. Dad looked over the crowd, his eyes landing on me for a moment, and I smiled. But then his gaze shifted to my brother-in-law, Rick, and he smiled even wider. And now Dad said, his voice filled with emotion, I want to officially announce my successor, the man who I believe is best suited to carry on the legacy of our family business. Rick. For a moment the room was silent. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard. My smile faltered as the crowd broke into applause, my ears ringing with the sound. Rick, my sister's husband, looked genuinely shocked as he stood up, hesitating for a moment before walking up to Dad, who pulled him into a tight hug. I watched in disbelief as they laughed and exchanged a few words I couldn't hear over the clapping. My chest tightened, and I felt my stomach drop. I tried to force a smile, but it felt like a grimace. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Dad had chosen Rick? My brother-in-law, who had joined the company only 2 years ago and had barely any experience running it. What could Dad possibly be thinking? I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was my sister, Jenny. Are you okay? She asked, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. My head was spinning. I wanted to confront Dad right then and there, to demand an explanation, but I knew I couldn't make a scene, not in front of everyone. So I clapped along with the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling like I was on the outside looking in on my own life. After what felt like an eternity, the applause died down, and people began to mingle again. I watched as Dad and Rick were surrounded by well-wishers, their faces beaming with excitement. I stood frozen, unable to move, until Jenny nudged me again. Are you going to talk to him? She asked softly. I nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, I will. I waited for an opening, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Finally, I saw my chance. Rick was pulled away by a group of relatives, and Dad was left standing alone for a moment, sipping his drink. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, can we talk for a minute? He turned to me, smiling warmly. Of course, son. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. Why did you give the business to Rick? I thought it was going to be me. Dad's smile faltered for a moment, and he looked at me with an unreadable expression. I know you did, son, he said softly. But I made the decision that I thought was best for the future of the company. Rick, I asked incredulously, my voice rising despite myself. He's barely been with us for 2 years. I've been working here my entire life. I know this business inside and out. How could you think he's a better choice? Dad sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. It's not about who's been here longer, son, he said, his tone calm but firm. It's about who I believe has the vision to take the company forward. Rick has a fresh perspective, new ideas. And I interrupted, feeling a surge of anger. I've been bringing ideas to you for years, and you've shot them down every time. And now you're giving it all to Rick? Just like that. He shook his head slowly. It's not just about ideas, it's about leadership, about the ability to make tough decisions. Rick has shown me that he has what it takes. I felt my blood boiling. What about me, Dad? Have I not proven myself? Dad's face softened a bit, and he reached out to put a hand on my shoulder, but I pulled away. You've always been a hard worker, son, and I'm proud of you for that. But sometimes, being too close to something makes it hard to see the bigger picture. Rick can bring something new to the table. I shook my head, stepping back. This isn't fair, Dad. It's not fair at all. He sighed again, a weary look crossing his face. Life isn't always fair, son, but I've made my decision, and I stand by it. I turned away, feeling a lump in my throat. I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed air. I walked out of the party, ignoring the curious looks from the guests, and made my way to the balcony. The cold night air hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I stood there, staring out into the city, my mind racing. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, had just been handed to someone else. And not just anyone, my brother-in-law, a man who hadn't put in a fraction of the time and effort I had. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Rick standing there, his expression a mix of guilt and hesitation. "Hey," he said softly. "Can we talk?" I clenched my jaw, not trusting myself to speak, but finally I nodded. I had no idea your dad was going to do that," Rick said quickly. "If I'd known, I would have told him to choose you. You deserve it more than anyone." "Save it, Rick," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "You got what you wanted. Congratulations." He shook his head. "No, man, that's not fair. I didn't ask for this. I don't want there to be any bad blood between us." I laughed bitterly. "Bad blood? You're taking over the business I've worked my entire life for, and you think there won't be bad blood?" Rick sighed, looking genuinely pained. "Look, if there's anything I can do, I want to make this right." I stared at him, my anger simmering. "Make it right? How, Rick? Are you going to step down? Give me what's rightfully mine." He hesitated, and that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to step down. He wasn't going to give it up. I turned away, feeling a fresh wave of anger wash over me. "Just leave me alone," I muttered. "I don't want to talk to you right now." Rick stood there for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I understand. But I'm here if you want to talk." I didn't reply. I just stared out into the city, my mind spinning with thoughts of betrayal, frustration, and a growing desire for revenge. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Dad, Rick, and even Jenny, who had been trying to play peacemaker. I threw myself into my work at the office, but every time I saw Rick's face, every time I heard his voice giving instructions, it felt like a fresh wound. I started to notice things I hadn't before. Rick's suggestions were being implemented, ideas I had proposed years ago that Dad had dismissed out of hand. Suddenly they were brilliant and innovative when Rick presented them. The hypocrisy was like salt in the wound. I felt like a stranger in my own company, watching as everything I had worked for was slipping through my fingers. One afternoon I found myself alone in Dad's old office, the one Rick had now taken over. I sat down in the leather chair, feeling the weight of all that had been lost. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the photo of Dad and me from years ago, when he first taught me how to read a balance sheet. I remembered the pride in his eyes, the way he had told me that one day, this would all be mine, and now it wasn't. I slammed my fist down on the desk, the sound echoing through the empty office. I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. I had to do something. I started by digging through old files, old reports, anything I could find that might show Rick in a bad light. I was looking for any mistake he'd made, anything I could use to prove that he was unfit to run the company. But Rick was smarter than I gave him credit for. His records were spotless, his work efficient and thorough. If there were any skeletons in his closet, they were buried deep. I decided to switch tactics. I began talking to employees, subtly probing to see how they felt about the new leadership. I found a few who were unhappy with the changes Rick was making, particularly the older employees who missed Dad's way of doing things. I knew I could use their discontent to my advantage. But the more I dug, the more I realized something unsettling. Many of the younger employees actually liked Rick's ideas. They appreciated his fresh approach, his willingness to take risks, to innovate. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But it made me realize that maybe, just maybe, Rick wasn't the incompetent fool I'd made him out to be in my mind. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I decided to confront Dad again. This time I would be more direct, more forceful. I found him at home, sitting in his study, reading the newspaper. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, walking into the room without waiting for an invitation. He looked up, surprised by my tone. "All right, son. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the party, and I need you to reconsider. You made a mistake choosing Rick over me, and I want you to fix it." Dad sighed, putting down his paper. "Son, we've already been over this." "No," I interrupted, "we haven't. You made a decision without even discussing it with me. I've given my life to this company, and you just handed it over to someone else. That's not fair." He looked at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. "I understand how you feel, son, but my decision stands. Rick is the future of this company, and I believe in him. I felt a surge of frustration. What about me, Dad? Don't you believe in me? Dad's expression softened. Of course I do, son. But sometimes believing in someone means knowing when to let them go, to find their own path. I stared at him, stunned. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, that maybe it's time for you to consider doing something else, something that makes you happy. You've been so focused on this company that you've forgotten to live your own life. I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. So, what? You want me to just walk away? Start over somewhere else? Dad nodded. Yes, if that's what it takes for you to find your own happiness. The business isn't the only thing in life, son. You're young, talented, and you have so much potential. Don't let this define you. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I don't want something else, Dad. I want what's mine. He sighed deeply. I'm sorry, son, but I've made my choice. I turned away, feeling a lump in my throat, and walked out of the room. I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt lost, angry, betrayed, and completely alone. The days turned into weeks, and I continued to show up at the office, even though every day felt like a battle. Rick was polite, always trying to bridge the gap between us, but I kept my distance. I couldn't bring myself to trust him, not after everything that had happened. Then, one morning, Rick called a meeting. All the department heads were there, and I could feel the tension in the room. Rick stood at the front, looking serious. I've been thinking a lot about the direction of the company, he began, and I believe it's time for a major change. A restructuring, if you will. I felt a knot in my stomach. What was he planning now? Rick went on to explain that he wanted to create a new division within the company, one that focused on digital transformation and modernizing our processes. He talked about bringing in new talent, investing in technology, and expanding our reach into new markets. As he spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I could see that his ideas had merit. On the other hand, it felt like he was dismantling everything I had worked for, everything I believed in. When he finished, there was a murmur of conversation among the team. Some seemed excited by the prospect, others wary. I waited until everyone else had spoken before raising my hand. Rick, I said slowly, these are big changes you're proposing. Have you considered how they'll affect our existing clients, our long-term relationships? Rick nodded. Absolutely. That's why I want you to head up the transition team. You know the company better than anyone, and I believe you're the right person to help guide us through this. I blinked, taken aback. This was unexpected. You want me to lead the transition? He nodded. Yes, I trust you, and I need your expertise to make this work. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long being angry, so long feeling betrayed, that I hadn't considered the possibility that Rick might actually value me, that he might want to work with me rather than against me. I nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. But I want full control over the team and the process. Rick smiled. Deal. Over the next few months, I threw myself into the new project with everything I had. To my surprise, Rick gave me the freedom I needed to make decisions, to bring in new people, and to implement changes my way. Slowly, I began to see that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the enemy I had made him out to be. Maybe he was just trying to do his best for the company, just like I was. As we worked together, I started to see a different side of Rick, a side I hadn't bothered to notice before. He was passionate, driven, and genuinely cared about the future of the company. And he respected me, in a way I hadn't expected. One day, after a particularly challenging meeting, Rick pulled me aside. You're doing a great job, you know, he said. I couldn't have done this without you. I nodded, feeling a strange warmth in my chest. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that. He smiled. I know it's been hard with everything that happened. But I hope you know that I'm not here to take anything away from you. I'm here to build something great, and I want you to be a part of that. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe this wasn't the path I had envisioned for myself, but it was a path nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, it was the right one. I took a deep breath and extended my hand. Let's do this, Rick. Together. He shook my hand firmly, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. And that, in itself, was worth more than anything.